Creative community, are you among the many artists who I've noticed lately, especially painters and photographers, who have ended up with this unfortunate dead area in the foreground? These dead zones are dragging down the entire composition. It's weakening it. So by the end of this video, you will know how to readdress this area, reinvigorate it, and have a much stronger composition going forward. So come on in the studio, let's jump in and let's bring all of those dead foregrounds back to life. Welcome behind the studio door, creative community. I'm artist Amy Funderburk, and let's go ahead and solve those pesky, troubling foregrounds. I'm standing in front of my painting Shavasana, the Release, today because I thought of all of my works, it was probably the best example of this illusion of deep space. And that's where you tend to hear the terminology foreground, midground, and background. Your foreground is the closest thing to the viewer. It's our way into a composition usually. It's sometimes going to block our eye from entering, or in the case of, let's say, for example, the ubiquitous path that leads you in, it invites the viewer to come into the composition. But your foreground, which is the closest thing to the viewer, isn't necessarily in the sharpest focus. It depends on how the artist has chosen to treat that and the depth of field. It's not necessarily even at the bottom of the composition. In the case of a landscape, for example, let's say you were standing on the edge of a cliff, very scary, and let's say the tree trunks were off the composition, off the picture plane, but the branches were the closest to you, closest to the viewer, whether or not they're in the sharpest focus. They are the closest, and they're at the top of the composition now. Maybe that's even one of the ways to solve this dead zone at the bottom I've been seeing lately. Ever since I started noticing this phenomenon of all these dead foregrounds, I started giving it a lot of thought as to some of the reasons that might be at the heart of this. And one thing I think might be an issue is perhaps an over-reliance on standard sizes. I know it's a lot easier to buy a 24 by 36 inch canvas or panel because it is readily available through the art supply store. Whereas a 17 by 24 is certainly not. That is not a standard size. And if you're working on paper, including photographers, you can cut your paper to whatever size you want. So that's a lot easier. But for painters who are working on panel or canvas, perhaps you could try stretching your own canvas to the size that you want, or getting a panel custom built for you, or to build your own. Or perhaps you could consider a diptych or a triptych, which is either 2 or 3 surfaces put together as one visual unit, and that way you could create your own custom size. Photographers, including those who take reference photographs to use later for other media, do you feel honor-bound to stick with the aspect ratios that your camera is providing you? You don't have to do that. You can crop in, whether it be with software or the darkroom. You can crop to whatever size your composition demands. Now, I recognize I am queen of the non-standard sizes. I will do these preliminary drawings, and whatever it needs to be is what I will create. Shavasana, the Release, is actually 44 by 32. Definitely not a standard size, but 36 by 48 just didn't work for this particular composition. The first potential culprit that I thought of when I began considering this topic is an over-reliance on the classic rule of thirds compositional tool. Now, if you're not familiar with this guidance, I will show you some examples shortly. But basically, it's if you have divided your picture plane into thirds both horizontally and vertically, and you have filled that, let's say, lower third with your foreground, especially if you've used a horizontal line, which is a passive line, and you don't have any break in it, and you don't have a way to tie that in and unify it with the rest of the composition or move that viewer's eye around the rest of the picture plane, you've deadened your foreground and you have created this isolated area. Here in his painting Versailles, I think that Auguste Renoir has given us a great example of how stagnant a horizontal line that doesn't lead your eye into the rest of the composition can make that foreground. But I think that the number one issue that artists can have with the foreground is to ignore it. When an artist's emphasis, which is their main idea or focal point, is in the midground or background, like Renoir has here, if they ignore the foreground or leave it without sufficient visual information, the area can end up looking dead or unfinished, or in this case, confusing. To my eye, I would say that I'm not sure if this foreground by Renoir is a wall or a path. What do you think? He's got that thin white line along the top of the foreground going from that sculpture on the right. That makes it look like a wall. But by the time my eye gets to the left, it looks like a path. I think if he had opened up the composition a little bit more around the area of the sculpture on the left, where our eye could better go over that bridge, then it would have made a more successful foreground. Just that classic pathway in for the viewer's eye is not alone enough for a successful composition. So the first two photography examples we're going to see, I took at a local park with this theme in mind. So this first image here, unless you Amy this up and you put some sort of magical rabbit or turtle in your very front foreground to say, follow me, come this way, that might be a reason to have such a long road. But otherwise, it's a bit much. And to me, the emphasis, you're going to want it to be on that sliver of lake, which right now you can kind of barely see because you've just got this really heavy amount of road in your foreground. The second example, I believe I moved a little bit closer, but mostly I just turned it to a horizontal format. You can now move the eye more easily to the lake so that you know where you're heading. Now, I think it's even more successful since there's not anything too exciting going on that far right side. If you were to crop in a little bit on the left and a little bit more on the right, but I do like that tree that's catching the light in the upper left. I would want to keep that tree, so I would just move it over. You want to make sure when you're cropping that the line of your road doesn't go right into the corner of your composition. That's one of those things that they say not to do, but this one is a really good rule not to break. I'm all about breaking some rules after you learn them with composition, but this is not one of them because it would be very awkward. So the art history examples that I'm going to show you now are all courtesy of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, thanks to their open access policy for public domain works. And I will put a link in the notes for the video. So this photograph is called The Sentinel's 315 Feet Yosemite. It's not Ansel Adams, it's Carlton E. Watkins. And he predated Ansel Adams in documenting Yosemite, and his efforts did help to inspire the creation of the National Park Service. So I am not wanting to disrespect Mr. Watkins. In fact, I have another photograph in a moment to show you that I really, really like. This was the one that I found that I felt had a dead zone in the foreground. It blocks you from really getting in there and makes the trees look shorter than they really are. I experimented with my photo editing software and I made the trees fictitiously taller and I cropped the bottom a lot, and that did help. But what actually I liked the best was cropping in on the sides and cropping the foreground a good bit. And that way it really made this welcoming background that my eye wanted to go in there and was able to get in there a lot easier than with this wider foreground in the front blocking my view. By cropping in, my eye was able to get in there into this kind of storybook narrative in the center. It's now being framed in by these giant trees, but they looked stunted with how big the foreground is in the original version, to my eye. Now this is Edgar Degas, dancers practicing at the bar. Now I've always thought of this as being called the watering can. A quick disclaimer, he's not a nice guy. things that I didn't know back in the day in art history class, different views that he held. This was such a good composition, though, to show you for this topic. I did decide to go ahead and include it, but I just want to issue that disclaimer. So talk about active diagonals. Talk about a wide foreground. It's not that you have to make your foreground small, but you've got active diagonals going one way, taking you back towards the wall. You've got the baseboard running with the bar on the wall up towards the dancers. You've got them crammed into the upper right-hand corner, and all that's balanced out by this watering can. Now, I always thought that he chose this as just this element that had the same shape as the dancers, and it does. But it's not just completely arbitrary. It was a standard fixture in the rehearsal rooms because when the ballerinas danced, they had to sprinkle water on the floor to keep the dust from rising up, and I found that interesting. Now imagine that you will recognize this as a Vincent van Gogh painting. This is wheat field with cypresses. And wow, talk about an active foreground. If you consider the yellow as very quickly leading your eye from the foreground into the midground, the green that's in the proper foreground, starting with the rocks in the center, it gets in there, it moves your eye even out of the picture plane, but back in when the green gets reintroduced, another diagonal, taking you past those cypresses and over to the smaller, scrubbier trees. And all this undulating brushwork, this directional brushwork is just terrific. So much movement in this piece. Very active foreground. In this small ink over graphite drawing, Wheatfield, Van Gogh has used a very similar foreground treatment in the lower right as he did in the previous painting. This drawing is dated 1888, the year before he painted Wheatfield with cypresses. I encourage you to make several quick preliminary sketches, develop longer preparatory drawings or studies, or take copious numbers of photographs to be sure your composition is working before taking on a larger surface. This painting is The Trout Pool by Worthington Whitridge. Remember earlier I mentioned that the foreground can also block the viewer's eye from going into the rest of the composition, and that's kind of what's happening here, but in a successful way. He frames the composition in with these trees on the sides, and then with the fallen tree that's blocking our visual path, so to speak. I think the reason it works so well is that there is some of the water with reflection between us and that fallen tree. So that helps us to make the leap of, we really want to go in there in that warm, inviting area, but the way is blocked, it's difficult. And so there's this sense of otherness to me and this tension between where we are and where we want to go. Now, I promised a positive shout out to photographer Carlton E. Watkins, and this is it. This is Sentinel Rock, Yosemite. You've got these three very distinct foreground, midground, and background areas here. Your foreground is very diminutive compared to this cathedral of a rock face you have in the midground, which is clearly the emphasis. But your highest contrast of values is in that foreground area. And then the background has the least amount of texture by comparison and the least amount of value contrast. And so that's kind of a classic way of looking at foreground, midground, and background. Gustave Moreau was a French symbolist. This is Oedipus and the Sphinx. And what I thought was really fascinating about this piece, and I've seen a reproduction of this painting 1,000 times, if you look in the foreground, there's actually body parts of the previous people who did not answer the Sphinx riddle correctly. And I thought, wow, that is really an effective foreground. He's using that area not only to convey the narrative, to push the narrative forward, or this is what'll happen to you, this is what the Sphinx will do, because otherwise it's not a bloodbath. She's just kind of hanging there on his chest. They don't look too upset. But that leg and that foot become diagonal lines, but diagonal lines with a message. Another foreground detail in Moreau's painting is a crown to the right of center behind the bones. With that one detail, Moreau lets us know that the Sphinx treated everyone equally. Art is decision-making, And so many of your compositional decisions depend on your goals for the artwork. What do you want your piece to say, and what emotions do you want to inspire in the viewer? And if you don't know the riddle of the Sphinx, I'll share it as a bonus at the end of this video. The Horse Fair is Rosa Bonheur's most famous painting. She was a French painter, and in that time period, the mid-1800s, she actually had to obtain permission to wear men's clothing to go to this horse market held in Paris so that it didn't cause too much attention for this female individual to be at this horse market. Can you believe it? But she would go there and sketch, and this is a very large piece. Please take note that it's 96¼ by 199½ inches. So it's very commanding just in terms of scale. This is one that I've charted out for you to see the rule of thirds as well as the halfway marks. And so the pale blue are the rule of thirds, and then the white are the halfway marks. So to me, the main character, if you will, the hero horse is the white one, and very close to the center, as it turns out, if you'll look at the marks. And it's also in the middle of that central third, isn't it? Now, another thing that I found fascinating when I charted this out is that the line of that dirt or sandy road or whatever, it ends back behind these horses. It ends right on that third mark. And then the rise of the land on the right, that's just shy of that third mark. So it's pretty clear to me that she must have kept some of these guidelines in mind when she was charting out her composition, don't you think? When using the rule of thirds, instead of isolating that lower area, you can use it to convey a clear spatial relationship between the viewer and the emphasis of your composition. Try activating your foreground with texture and value changes, as Bonheur does here in the Horse Fair. She also uses a strong diagonal through that tree line, and this creates a wedge shape that releases this dynamic burst of horses. Renoir doesn't have that movement in his Versailles painting, and while he does offer some color and value changes within his foreground, the differences are very subtle. If you carefully chart out your composition but isolate your thirds, you'll probably get a stagnant look, or your lower area might look like an afterthought. The last piece I want to show you is Low Tide Riverside Yacht Club by Theodore Robinson. He's followed the rule of thirds on the right, and then on the left, that's right there around the halfway mark as well. And the foreground is actually taking up a good bit of real estate, isn't it? But it leads your eye in beautifully with these patches of, I guess it's probably mossy or probably seaweed rocks that lead your eye like this arrow pointing right to that one sailboat. Quickly about color as well, he started with an underpainting, a tone all over the whole canvas of this orange, this kind of burnt orange color. And orange and blue are complementary colors. They're opposite colors on the color wheel. And so that dynamic interplay between the orange and the blue I find really satisfying and really just kicks it up a notch to think in terms of the dynamism of this sunshiny day. I really hope that you'll find some of these ideas to be helpful as you go forward with your compositions in the future and how you treat your foregrounds. Let me know in the comments what you found the most interesting or the most helpful, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Please don't forget to like and subscribe and hit that notification bell, because these things really help my channel to grow and help me to bring you more creative content just like this. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time. The Sphinx from Greek mythology was depicted with a human female's head, a lion's body, eagle wings, and a serpent's tail, though Gustave Moreau has taken liberties with the tail here. To pass by her without being eaten, a traveler would have to answer this riddle. What creature walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening? Don't forget that if you guess incorrectly, the Sphinx could add you to her foreground. So you can pause the video here if you want to ponder the riddle before I reveal the answer. The solution is the human who crawls as a baby, walks on 2 legs as an adult, then uses a cane in old age. Did you get it right?